Welcome to the Supply Geek podcast, the show that turns shipping containers and glossy corporate advertising into real stories worth sharing. I'm your host, Ben Thornton-Jones, and whether you're a supply chain geek like me, a conscious consumer, or just someone who's always wondered how the tuna ends up in your sushi, you are in the right place. Each episode, we unpack the hidden stories behind the stuff we use and the things we do every day, from palm oil plantations to the milk supply chain, from cargo ships to carbon emissions. We're not just about moving goods, we're here to move minds. So grab your map of the world, adjust your safety vest of skepticism, and let's dive into the weird and wonderful world of supply chains. Let's get geeky. So my guest today and top tuna geek is Iain Mahood. Iain, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here as we delve for the first time in this series anyway, away from land, I would say, and we're going to delve into the seas, which is really fantastic to be able to do, and to discuss tuna and also what I expect could be maybe a broader topic around seafood and sourcing from marine environments. But before we really dive into that, as we always do, we want to find out a little bit about you. So please tell us a little bit about yourself, your career, and why do you know more than most people about tuna and seafood?
Hi, Ben. Thanks for that introduction. So I've my career has, I guess, spanned some 40 odd years or so far. It's not quite neatly divided into three parts. So I spent the first part of my career in the catering industry. I, in fact, trained as a chef originally from leaving school. Spent a number of years working in London and further afield, sometimes abroad. From there, I went to join a retailer in the UK, Marks and Spencer. I spent just shy of 21 years at Marks and Spencer doing a variety of jobs, as is typical for one of those retailers. So jobs as diverse as buying produce, buying wine, opening restaurants, introducing brands, buying fish. And I ended my career there managing the grocery department, so the ambient grocery department that included ambient tuna and ambient salmon. So in cans, I mean by that. And then I spent 10 years working in the supply chain, so supplying UK retailers and retailers around the world, predominantly with sustainable tuna and other fish. So it's been a career of three parts, and I left that role 6 months ago, and I'm now doing some work within those supply chains.
Fantastic. Well, loads and loads of experience there. So you're the ideal person to speak to about this topic. So thanks again so much for the time. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation because, again, I keep mentioning this, but when I started this series, I leaned heavily on a few people that I knew and therefore supply chains that I'd kind of had some experience of and worked in. But I have never had experience of the tuna or seafood sector, little bit in cod liver oil, I would say. I've got a bit of experience in that side of things, but certainly not by any means the level of experience. So really looking forward to this myself today as a geek, and we have many geek listeners as well. So I think it'll be really fantastic to delve behind what some people might know about this particular supply chain. So let's get started. Doing a bit of very light research for this episode. I looked up a few things, it's very geeky. So let's talk about some stats. Interesting, I read that a 2024 survey from Hovis, a UK bread maker, when they were surveying favourite sandwiches in the UK, tuna comes third. In fact, I think after chicken salad and BLT, which is fair enough. I would probably put it in that order as well. But we know very well loved in the UK. And I think it goes broader as well, looking at kind of the global consumptions. Big consumers like the US, China is growing, the European Union in general, lots of countries like France and others consuming a lot. But interesting one that jumped out for me that I probably had some understanding of, I read that around a quarter of global tuna consumption is actually Japan. Huge consumer of tuna. And I think going outside of sandwiches and things that we think of tuna coming from cans, sushi, sashimi, that type of cuisine is hugely involved with fish. And so big consumption there. But, apart from those sort of light touches, I think of tuna as, I think most people would understand it's a fish, but I'm sure there's maybe different varieties, maybe different grades, maybe different qualities. So it'd be great to really get your knowledge and understanding from your extensive career to really understand this supply chain. So let's start with that. Maybe you can just take us through your knowledge of the tuna supply chain and kind of where it starts, which I'm going to assume is in the ocean and from a fishing level.
Yeah. So that's again, thanks for that. So there's getting figures for total volumes of tuna is can be problematic because different people report things. But there's something like somewhere between 6.5 to 7 million tons of tuna fished annually around the world. We'll maybe dig into that a little bit later on where that comes from. But that's predominantly divided into 5 key species. So we've got skipjack that we typically find in cans, skipjack tuna. That's what the Europeans tend to eat, certainly the UK. There's then yellowfin, which is also sometimes put into cans, sometimes eaten fresh. Albacore, more commonly eaten fresh. Species that most people maybe haven't come across, big eye, which is sometimes canned, sometimes eaten fresh. And of course, bluefin, that is the one we know of as the kind of king of tuna for sashimi and sushi. So it's a big business. Most of those species, the first 3 of those species are predominantly caught in tropical waters. So skipjack, yellowfin, and big eye are caught pretty much within the tropics. So Tropic of Capricorn to Tropic of Cancer, that really defines their catching areas. Albacore and bluefin have got a slightly wider catching area. So recent years, with some of the effects of temperature changes, we're starting to see some bluefin actually being caught in the UK and around the coast of Ireland. So for the first time ever, I think it is this year, we've now got a quota, very small quota for bluefin in the UK. But, some of those stocks are moving and weather patterns are beginning to affect some of those. But the ones we're talking about, the ones my experience really is in, are what we would call tropical tunas.
Wow. Okay. And this is a big fish, right? Or do they vary in terms of those different species? Because I've seen some videos of a tuna being caught, and I'm not sure which one it is. You'll probably obviously let me know now. But I mean, they're huge. They're
So,
huge fish.
I mean, there's a variety of sizes. So you tend to find with the tuna that we use in the canning industry, and normally skipjack is a modest sized fish. I wouldn't say small, but it would typically run from maybe a kilogram upwards to probably 5, 6, 7, 8 kilos. Yellowfin probably a little bit bigger. And then you start getting into the bigger species. So albacore would commonly be bigger. And then, of course, you'll have seen the big bluefin on, Wildest Catch and the TV program where guys are hauling 200 pound tunas.
Yeah.
All good American TV, but they're much bigger and they're much older typically. So skip yellowfin are quite quite prolific fish. They breed constantly throughout the year, so they're constantly being supplied. And depending on where and what time we catch them, they'll be within that kind of kilo and a half up to 5 kilos normally. So quite relatively small. So what we eat is not kind of the same ones as we see on the TV.
Okay, good to understand. Yeah, I think I've probably, YouTube and things is probably more drawn to the huge ones, to show how impressive they are and those being carved up and things like that. So that's really good to understand. In terms of, so you obviously talked around the areas that they're obviously they're fished from. Is that, obviously you talked about that kind of, when you're talking about the tropics, that is a band around the earth, but is it concentrated in a certain place specifically?
Yeah, there are some concentrations. So you'd find probably the biggest fishery in the world. Fishery is an interesting phrase because we use the word fishery to describe many things, but in this context, it's a group of countries, is based around Micronesia and Polynesia. So out in the Pacific, it's a group called the PNA, which is parties to the Nauru Agreement. So a group of islands out there that would include places like the Marshall Islands, Nauru, Palau, Papua New Guinea, Solomon, that type of island. They would be fishing between them something like 20% of all of the skipjack that's fished in the world. So that's a really big fishery.
Wow.
Then next, probably down in size in terms of single country, would be Indonesia. It's probably accounting for about 20% as well. And then you start to see some declining countries. So South America's big with Ecuador. There's Mexico, Brazil, some of those places. Then within the Indian Ocean, you've got Maldives has got a reasonable sized catch, and you'll have other nations fishing in those oceans. So, whilst the fish comes from the tropics, not necessarily is it all landed in the tropics. It may be going to Taiwan or Korea or other places who will have
Mm.
fishing. So it's spread in a few kind of hotspots around the world.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great to understand. And maybe next you can, I don't know whether you've ever actually experienced this, maybe you have, but I mean, take our listeners and viewers into, I don't know, being on a fishing vessel. What are we talking about? What is the method of catching these fish in those types of fisheries?
So as in most fisheries, there's 2 or 3 different sorts of catching that goes on, or we would talk about gear, fishing gear. The predominant one, the biggest one used around the world, is what we call purse seining, and that's used typically for shoaling fish like skipjack and yellowfin. There'll be pretty large vessels, probably 60 meters plus. They will use a net that could be as much as potentially up to a kilometer wide, and they'll find the fish, and we'll come back to how they find the fish and some of the possibly more destructive elements of that in a moment. But they'll sail the net around the shoal of fish, tie it up like a purse, and then scoop all the fish out of that. So that's probably the biggest method. Then for some of the bigger fish, you might be using either a hand line, which exactly as it says, a small line with some bait on it, or a lure to catch single fish, or a long line, which can be, again, significant length, can be 40, 50 kilometers long. And I did say kilometers.
Oh,
Be let out with baited hooks, and that will then be left for a period of time and then brought back in. That too has got a number of problems we'll come back to. And then the more sustainable and low impact method is what we call pole and line, or 1x1 pole and line, where you've actually got men on the back of a boat. It could be women, typically men, on the back of a boat with a rod and a line and a hook. And they will catch skipjack and tuna. Much of the skipjack and tuna is caught like that. Sorry, skipjack tuna is caught like that in places like Indonesia and Maldives. So those are the 3 big ones. There's another method that's sometimes used called gill netting, which is a net that the fish swim through. But the first 3 are the biggest, and those in that order is really the volumes that we catch from them.
wow. I mean, some of those numbers there that you talked about, I mean, it's just mind-boggling to think. I mean, I assume the boat's probably, drawing this net that you talked about that could be a sort of kilometre wide must be pretty significant, because a kilometre wide purse, as you called it, would be picking up a lot of marine life.
They are, and they're not without their problems. So they are very big industrial boats, and it's a business. So notwithstanding the fact that they're often set to sea for a long time, they're often subsidised by distant water nations, which is quite unfair. There's often questionable human rights for some of the people on board of the boats, but also they can be quite destructive in the way they fish. So often to attract the fish, they'll use a thing that we call a FAD, which is a fish aggregating device. And that can be as simple as a raft with some ropes tied underneath it. And as the ropes start to attract some algae and seaweed and growth, then that attracts the small fish, attracts the big fish. And the industrial vessels will be deploying those in their hundreds into the ocean, often with a radio transmitter on top and a depth sounder underneath to see what's happening. They'll then go back and relocate those. They'll fish around those, so they'll scoop everything up that's around that FAD, which could include sharks, turtles, what we call ETP, endangered and threatened species, or protected species. And there can be up to kind of 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe 10% of those that get landed onto the boat, which is, is quite a destructive way of fishing. And then once they've landed the fish, that FAD is often left in the water for another day, but can of course blow away. So, you deploy these things, as I say, in their hundreds. They can then drift away and quite often end up beaching on foreign shores, damaging delicate coral, doing damage. Or they can continue fishing. So if they're badly designed with hanging nets underneath them, they can be catching fish and sea mammals, marine life, kind of forever. These nets don't degrade very quickly. So we would be very wary of anyone using those sorts of that sort of gear, that sort of equipment. But it does go on, and it's used heavily on the high seas for a lot of the tuna we see in the supply chain. And then long lining, which is, as I say, kind of these lines up to, typically in the kilometers, as long as 50 kilometers. They will have a hook every so many meters. They'll be baited with herring, mackerels, whatever, to go into the water. But they too have big problems with bycatch. So they typically can catch sharks, anything else that's under the water that bites on and can get hooked. And they're also quite poor for when they're being baited and put into the water. There's often a problem with seabirds. So you often think of your image of seabirds around the back of a fishing boat, throwing all this fish over the back on hooks. It's going into the water at quite a speed, and you quite often get seabirds caught in that. So whilst there's some work going on to try and help alleviate that, it's another problem that has quite an impact on the wider environment, not just the fish we're trying to catch.
Yeah, wow. Really, you're starting to build that real picture of what it's like and the scale of these operations, because it's a huge industry, right? This is, fishing broadly is, we're just talking some numbers for tuna, but I can't remember. I think when I was looking at some statistics, I think tuna actually is relatively small in terms of the total volume of fish catch globally as well.
I don't like to contradict you, as it's your podcast, but I think, no, tuna would probably be the biggest wild catch species out there.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So in the UK, typically consumption would be amongst the tuna, salmon, prawn, and then the whitefish. Cod and haddock would be our big species we eat here. So we're pretty conservative in the UK as to what we eat. Obviously, canned tuna is a large part of that. But globally, tuna would be the biggest single, as a group, the biggest single species. And it's quite
right.
about the five. There's a number of other tunas in there, but between those, they would be pretty much the biggest single catch.
Oh, okay. Interesting to know. And I kind of hate to ask this question because you explained so well those different methods of catching, but partly I say I hasten to ask because I might know the answer. But which is the most broadly used method?
So the most broadly used method is the Persane method. So that's the big, for the tuna we'll eat in cans. So our skipjack and our yellowfin that we're probably more familiar with in the UK. Most of that is caught by Persane, which is a big net that's sailed around and scooped up. But there are people doing good stuff. So a lot of the supply chains that I've been involved in, or in fact, all the supply chains I've been involved in have been pole and line, where we use bait and hooks, and we have multiple people fishing off the back of a boat, and those tuna are caught one by one. So it's just like you imagine as a kid, and it can be as simple, very often is as simple as a bamboo cane with maybe 12 feet of fishing wire or fishing filament on it, and a hook, not unlike the one I can hold up to your camera now, literally like this.
Mm-hmm.
You find the fish, and the fish are found by traditional methods more commonly. So probably the most advanced thing that's used these days is high-power binoculars, but you'll have fishermen looking out on the boat to see where there's bird activity, where there's water activity, and or using binoculars to find that. And of course, they'll go back to known areas of the seabed or the ocean where they can find these fish. Once they've found them, there's a little bit of there's a little bit of help insofar as we use some water. So we spray some water onto the top of the ocean to start and get a feeding frenzy. We use some live bait, which we've caught, so small fish, milkfish. Those are thrown into the water. The fish then get into a feeding frenzy, and they're caught one by one on a rod and a reel. And the beauty of that is it's virtually bycatch free. So when we talked about sharks and turtles, there's also what we call bycatch, which is non-target species. So we're looking for tuna if we catch something else, but we don't really see any of that in the pole and line fishery. So there are good operators out there that are doing really good jobs. The pole and line industry also doesn't use any drifting fads that can move off and damage those delicate ecosystems that we talked about. So there's a mix in the market. The biggest one by far is Persane, and we would say there's a lot of work to do to improve that and get it to a sustainable standard. And then there's good operators who are fishing one by one.
Yeah, great. Yeah, really interesting to know. And great to hear that there's obviously some work being done on that Persane method as well, because it's, unlikely that it's going away anytime soon, I would assume. So you've got to try and improve it, at least as a method to try and tackle that and some of the challenges that you mentioned there.
Absolutely.
Great to hear. I think that's really clear in terms of, we talked around the species of tuna. Great. And please continue to correct me if I've got anything wrong. Great to hear that it's definitely the largest one. It's makes me realize that this is a fantastic one to do when we're looking at seafood sourcing in terms of this podcast. Also hearing those different catching methods and some of the stats that you gave on the kind of global volumes there. maybe now we can talk a little bit about the people involved in the supply chain. You mentioned a couple of things there that I thought were quite interesting. One, talking about how these ships can be at sea for quite some time. I think some people might have a romantic thought of a fisherman going out early in the morning and then coming back in the evening, hopefully with a decent catch, but I don't think that's going to be the case. So it'd be great to talk a little bit about that. And then also maybe you could talk a little bit about, I guess, how is the industry structured? Who owns the shipping vessel? Who's working on the shipping vessels? If you could relay some of that, that would be really interesting to know the people involved in the industry.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's an enormously big question you just asked me. There's probably many different methods of ownership or conditions of ownership and usage of these boats as there are boats. But let me break it down into a few of the kind of key ones. So I guess it tends to go in size order. So if we start with the biggest and possibly some of the most prolific and possibly most destructive ones, those big industrial fishers, they're often owned by companies. They're often deployed from distant waters, so they might be fishing in an ocean that they don't actually is not on their coast. They'll have a reasonable sized crew. I haven't got too much experience with those boats, but they would have, in the tens of people on them with, I guess, a captain, skipper, nautical crew, engineering crew, and then a number of people to operate the fishing operation. They're often owned by companies or entities. They're often serviced by further vessels, so there might be a further vessel there that will bring fuel, bring food, etc. They often don't go home for many, many months at a time. So if they've sailed to an ocean, they'll continue fishing for as long as they can. And yeah, those will be making up the guys. Those will be the guys who are catching the big majority of purseine fish. Longliners are somewhat similar, so they'll be out in the deep ocean with these long trails of hooks behind them, catching whatever they catch, and they'll often be much the same. So they'll typically catch the fish; it'll be frozen on board, and then one of the things that can make this whole supply chain a little bit murky is these fish are often moved frozen from one boat to another boat, collected, transshipped, we call that, and then moved on. And that can give rise to hiccups in the supply chain, if you like, where we can't be certain where fish has come from. And obviously, fishing happens in the deep, deep depths of the ocean, and it's very difficult to get any oversight for. So transshipment is another kind of issue with some of that type of fishing and that methodology. Then you get down to smaller boats, and I guess at the smaller end, the more artisanal end, which is typically the one by one. And some guys with small nets, but mostly the one by one. Those boats, different countries have different methodologies. Some of the countries I've procured from would be typically community ownership or single family ownership. And those boats would be going out for maybe a 15 to 24 hour trip, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Different countries, different methods. Next one up would probably go out for 3, 4, 5 days. But it would be the same kind of thing. And they're fishing much more in coastal waters rather than in the depths of the high seas.
Wow, yeah, really interesting to know. And you talking there about how you maybe for the larger ships you might get these sort of relief vessels that would go out and refuel, I guess take stock away as well that they've caught as well. So ultimately that allows these larger boats to just maintain their presence in the ocean and maybe their crew for these, months on end, as you talked about.
Absolutely, and it's it doesn't lead to best practice sometimes, so it can open up less good practices. Those other vessels, those supply vessels, are often deploying some of the fads for these aggregating devices, which is not great really. There's again varying numbers to how many fads there are in the ocean, but it runs into thousands. It's hard to think of because we don't often go out to the high seas ourselves, but when these things are bobbling around doing their stuff, pretty destructive. So they're doing that. They're transshipping fish, bringing fish in, potentially bringing people in and out. So there might be changes of certain members of the crew, but it's a red point for potentials for human rights problems and abuses where people are on the boats and can't get off very easily. It's a pretty tough life on those bigger boats. And then the smaller you get into some of the smaller nations, as I say, there'll be smaller vessels down to the very smallest. And then on the handline, for some of the higher end tuna, some of those handline boats can be pretty small indeed. They might have 3 or 4 people on them, and they'll be handlining. And I guess you see, we talked a little bit just before we came on air about the kind of the fishing programs of on the TV with guys with a few rods, 3 or 4 guys,
Mhm.
bluefin in the US. So there's a variety of different methods of owning and servicing those vessels.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. A couple of points that you talked about. I mean, in terms of kind of transparency and traceability, really interesting to touch on that. It comes up in every single episode that we have because most supply chains have a real challenge with this because we talk through the different steps, and the more steps, the more hands that you go through.
Absolutely.
It's very hard to keep a track of exactly where things have come from, especially when they're grouped together with, sources from lots of different locations. As soon as they're mixed, so to speak, then where do you have the traceability that people can really understand where their foods come from?
It's really hard. It's really hard in the world of fish because most of this fish is frozen as soon as it's either on board or as soon as it's landed. So most of the skipjack, certainly we take in yellowfin, is frozen. Some of the bluefin and albacore is possibly frozen or possibly chilled, but there's a vast amount of this is frozen. It's very difficult to keep a good chain of custody, if you like, for that supply chain.
Mm.
So again, smaller is often better. So where there are
Hmm.
smaller fisheries, more artisanal, landing to a single point where fishing can be recorded and counter checked, etc. That's good. Where you've got bigger industrial boats where fish is often transshipped into a further vessel, possibly, as you say, there might be a number of vessels on there. That then gets much, much harder to guarantee, I guess, the supply chain that you're using. Europe is quite good, quite advanced on this. So when you buy a can of tuna, somewhere it should tell you which sector of the ocean it's come from. And the FAO have got subdivided the oceans up into numeric blocks. So you'll see possibly in your can of tuna, it'll say FAO 51, which is in the Indian Ocean, or FAO whatever, a different area, or it could tell you a description. So it might say Northeast Atlantic, not for tuna. It might say Southwest Pacific, whatever. There'll be names that are prescribed and can be used. So there is an effort being made to make sure that we know where the fish comes from, but there are all kinds of figures that would suggest that not all fish is as clearly labeled as it might be.
Yeah, I'm sure that's definitely the case in what is very, very complex supply chain. The other thing and the beauty of doing this series is I get to sort of notice very similar threads between
Yeah.
all supply chains that I go through, and another one, whether it's a previous episode that we haven't launched yet, but one that I did on cocoa. There was the talking about cocoa trees that, to reach the plantation was sort of, I don't know, 6-7 hours down a dirt track, middle of nowhere. Same with palm oil, get something very, very similar that takes hours and hours to get to these locations. I mean, there's nowhere more hidden, I think, than, one sole boat bobbing around in the middle of the ocean. I mean, you've got no prying eyes on that. And I guess that's, very hard to truly understand what's going on there and maybe some of the challenges that come into that.
It's really hard, and the global community continues to try and improve some of that traceability through various bits of supranational legislation that we're looking to get adopted that make sure that boats that aren't correctly registered or legally fishing can't land in a port, and a number of other things. But it's not all nations sign up to these things very quickly. And often if the boats are being serviced out of other areas, then back to their home nation, we have little knowledge of where some of that fish goes or where it comes from. It's problematic, and you're right. It's like like many other supply chains, I guess. Smaller, as is the case in you talk about oil and some of the other products you've looked at, or some of the other commodities you've looked at, where you've got single entity farms or operations where you've got good people operating them, and it's a tight supply chain. You can have much more confidence in what you're buying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, either sort of smaller supply chains or less actors in the chain, I guess, would be the other thing as well. But it's always very, very challenging because, each level of the supply chain is generally doing a slightly different job and is, mostly needed rather than vertical integration, as you would call it, which might be another way that you could do things as well.
Yeah, and once we've landed fish and it's frozen, it's then a traded commodity, typically. So there are some that are more vertical. So some countries, Maldives is a good example. They have fishing, they have landing, they have a cannery. So there's a very limited chance for anything to go wrong in the supply chain. But then a lot of the fish that's caught and traded will be in frozen lots. It will go to some of the major processing centers around the world. So it's not necessarily canned or packed in the area that it's come from. You know, you'd have big areas. South America has some big canneries. The Philippines have some big canneries, though not a massive fishery. Thailand cans a lot of tuna for us. So these guys are all relying on the quality of their supply chains and the trust of the people they're buying from, that the fish they're getting is what they think it is.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it was actually going to be my next question to talk about the supply chain. So you've talked really clearly about, you know, the species, it's the different fishing methods, they're frozen on boats and then, you know, transported to the ports. Then you said it's this globally traded commodity. But then that next level, a huge volume of it will be going into cans. And there are, I guess that would be the next level in the supply chain, that you've got these, are there quite a few companies that are canning tuna? Because I guess I'm thinking, how does that then become, you know, every supermarket may have its own brand, or you have some global names, but maybe they're not the canner of the tuna.
Yeah. So I mean, without really going into detail of any of those names, there are a number of canneries that supply both some of those big names that we know from the high street. They will also be canning for retailer own brands. There are some that supply in the UK, just retailer labels, but they'll also be supplying people in the US and the rest of Europe. So yeah, are there a lot of canners? I suppose probably not a lot, and there are some big ones. You know, there are some key players out there that can for a lot of people. But yeah, it's a relatively tight business. But you've got, they're buying product from all over the world, and back to those frozen tunas. So you've caught your fish and it's all been frozen. You could then be putting that into a frozen carrier with maybe 3,000 tons on it, and that will then be sailed into one of these processing centers, divided depending on who it's been sold to. So, if there's 3,000 tons on there, will be going to one canner, one supplier, or it could be divided. There are, it can be quite a convoluted supply chain. Then, for the bigger tuna, those are often, there's a greater ability with the bigger tuna, the big albacores and the big bluefins, to actually individually mark the fish. I suppose what might good look like for those would be where we're close to getting to now, where you can catch a fish. You can, with pretty much pinpoint accuracy, put a QR code on that fish that will tell you where it was caught, what time it was caught, where it's from, etc., etc. And that's the fish. So for the very, very high end, you'd be seeing more of that.
Yeah.
That's not really my level of experience or expertise. But on the more aggregate end, where fish is going into cans, you rely on your supply chain to be aggregating the tuna correctly, telling you where it's from, and making sure that's where it is from. And of course, like all supply chains, and the ones the other people you've spoken to, there are better territories and less good territories for a variety of reasons. There are fisheries I know which are solely one type of fishing and one type of fish, so that's a pretty secure supply chain. Maldives being example, it's all pretty much tuna. It's some skipjack and some yellowfin, but there's no other fishery really to speak of there. So you can be pretty confident that's going to be clear. To other nations where there might be mixed fisheries, there might be mixes of gear, so you can be less sure what you're getting. And then to kind of those that are downright maybe not playing by the rules, one might say, where we know there's more fish being sold than officially landed sometimes.
Right.
It's a murky supply chain, and finding your way through it is complex, especially with all those pieces in. So from the fishing through to the landing, the freezing, the shipping onto factories, and then relying on the factories to use the right products in the right can, working with good operators. And most responsible actors are doing that. They're doing their very best to. But there's again a world of customers out there who are less concerned about it than maybe those customers that we'd be more familiar with.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, fascinating to know. And you're always going to have this mix, of good actors, bad actors, and all the different connotations between. Yeah, great to understand that. Let's maybe talk now a little bit about price. It would be great to understand, and again, what we've talked about in other ones is what impacts the price of tuna. How have you seen the price change maybe over the last 5, 10 years? Where is it currently at? Be really interesting to understand that, because that can also heavily impact what's happening in the supply chain too. And the reason I mention is you did talk about it being, a globally traded commodity. So I imagine that there is some price wars going on there, potentially between markets, fisheries, things like this. It would be great to understand that.
Yeah. So I guess at a raw material level, it's a fairly simple supply and demand equation for tuna. In my experience, I've seen raw material price probably. I'm just trying to think of the best way to quote it. I've seen it treble in price and halve in price over that time. So you're talking many hundreds and thousands of dollars, or hundreds or thousands of dollars per ton. But it is, yeah, there are factors in there that are quite interesting. So you go through periods in certain oceans where fishing is poor. So that can be down to weather effects, down to things like El Nino has an effect on fishing, down to, some of the climate change we're seeing looks to be having effects in terms of water temperature, in terms of later storms, not particularly relevant, but some of the commentary I've been listening to in the last few days about the hurricanes in Jamaica. Some of the anecdotal evidence is that they've been having hurricanes in kind of June, July, which they've never experienced before, much earlier. So water temperature and weather patterns make a big difference to the volume of fish. And then, you go through periods where fishing is very good. So, the converse to that, the conditions are excellent, and the fishing vessels can be out catching full loads of fish, bringing it home. They then end up with lots of fish on the market that press prices. I suppose you've got supply coming and demand needed, and then you've got this piece in the middle, which is cold storage. So where frozen, you can end up with a glut in the freezer and limited demand, so that will suppress prices. You can end up with not enough freezing space, so guys will be trying to discount price to move fish through. Yeah, it's a kind of classic supply and demand model.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and interesting just to hear that it's never one thing, right? There's multiple factors that go into the fluctuation in price, like you say, supply, demand, even in terms of that cold storage that you talked about there. It's another thing that you see also that impacts it, but also you touching on climate change, the warming of the oceans, impacting habitats, and impacting fish stocks as well. So it's going to be multiple.
And then, I mean, it's worth just adding on to that bit, I suppose. That then when you start and convert your fish into canned fish, you then have a number of other inputs that go in. So you can see that you're using steel or aluminium for your cans.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly input has a cost, steel input has a cost. Tariffs have a cost on the raw materials. So, you think about the tariff wars we're currently going through.
Mm-hmm.
Then typically within your can, you're putting fish. You've got labor in there that has a cost. Certain parts of the world look at minimum wages, so you might see wages increasing that you can't do too much around. You then have the media that goes in there. So in the UK and in lots of Europe, I guess, we'd probably be using brine, which is relatively cheap and anodyne, doesn't change too much. Spring water can move in price, is affected by the price of shipping. Olive oil, you'll be aware. I'm not sure if it's been in your view. Over the last 2 or 3 years, massive droughts in Europe. We have big shortages of olive oil. Olive oil prices go through the ceiling. Sunflower oil at the time of the Ukraine war breakout, we were all worried about getting those sunflower oil 3 years ago. So all those factors then go into the can. And then probably the next part that affects price as the customer sees it is the cost of shipping and duty or tariffs. So global shipping rates have moved, constantly move. We're in a period of probably less volatility now, but coming out of COVID, we saw prices move tenfold to ship a container of fish. So
Wow.
that can have an enormous impact on the price of the fish. Pay duty based on the price of the shipping. So all of these things add up to impact the final price that hits the supermarket and the customer shelf, or the supermarket shelves and the customer ultimately.
Yeah,
So
no.
quite a lot, and there's many of those things are out of the hands of the supply chain.
Yeah, of course, of course. No, super interesting to understand because, of course, we have focused a lot of this on tuna, but a final can of tuna is not just tuna. It's all of those other elements and all of the logistics, the labour that goes into getting onto that shelf, and the retailer themselves as well that's selling it and advertising it and all of those types of things. So, no, really fascinating to understand. Maybe we can keep on the consumer end now and talk about labeling, because I think that would be an interesting one. Because from my experience, on let's talk about a can of tuna, I've kind of seen the pole and line logo, or at least being talked about. I've also seen MSC, Marine Stewardship Council logo, which would be great for you to talk a little bit about. I mean, it feels like a product that has for quite some time, and albeit in the UK, which is my experience as a consumer, has been trying to explain to the customer that the attributes that go into the sourcing of this particular product. So it'd be great to understand what those different elements are, and I guess going back to some of the challenges that we talked about, how robust they are.
Yeah. So I mean, clearly in the UK and I guess the global north, if you like, there are legal requirements for labels. So all standard stuff that we know about, such as nutrition and weight and declared weight and drained weight, etc. The further regulations that aren't always quite as straightforward, you should be able to find on any can in the UK or Europe a definition of which fish is inside the can. So usually for us, it's skipjack. Europe, sometimes it may be yellowfin or albacore, but it's typically skipjack for us. So somewhere on the can, it should denote what the species is. It should also tell you the region it's caught in. I think I referenced earlier the Food and Agriculture Organization, part of the UN, have divided up the ocean into a number of different blocks, and you should be able to see where your fish is caught. So beyond that, messaging gets down to, I guess, where the retailers, what they want to tell you and what they see as a selling message. So if you think back many, many years ago, dolphin safe and dolphin friendly was the kind of start of this. And I think there was an entity, a US based guy, who started really pressing the industry to make sure that the tuna was dolphin friendly. So that meant that the boats weren't looking to find a dolphin and then scooping the dolphin and the tuna up together, because they often swim together. So that was probably the most that was probably the first one of those logos that we've seen. We've then seen, I've got a stack of cans here on my desk I'm just looking at as we talk, and I can see messages such as responsibly sourced, which, is a fairly nondescript message, and retailers go through lots of machinations to decide what's good, what's bad, responsibly sourced, carefully sourced, Then I guess you're right. MSC is a big certifier of many fisheries. It certifies across all kinds of fisheries, not just tuna, but all marine fisheries. It's got its own standard that it's developed over a number of years. It looks quite it's quite focused on certain elements of the fishery and less focused on other elements. So it looks at environmental impact, management of the fishery, health of the stock. Doesn't really look beyond that to how the people in the supply chain are treated, or some of that, the social aspects of the fishery. It has recently reviewed its standard and improved certain aspects of it, but a number of people will use that as a standard, and there are, I think, about half of the tuna that we see is probably MSC certified. There is a cost to carrying that label, so it's not a free ride for either the people catching or the retailer. So some people would choose not to use the label, may still be procuring from the fishery, but it's probably the sign that people would recognize the most. Like many of those consumer signs, I think people maybe recognize it, think it's a thing for good, couldn't really tell you too much more about it. And I would think the same is true for probably fair trade that people see on their chocolate or their cocoa or their coffee. They know it's good because they've seen it, not really sure what it means. Or the red tractor in the UK, it's a logo, it's a sign for good. They don't really need to know too much about it. And consumers are often making their decision based on the retailer they go into. There's an expectation that the retailer has a set of standards that you're going to be happy with going in there. So there are those things. Polar lines often called out, so catching methods are called out. A number of people will talk about fad-free, so those aggregating devices we spoke about earlier. Some people put that on the can. I'm not really sure how much customers understand about what that means or what it is. And then obviously there's pretty typically there might be some health messages on there. Tuna itself is an inherently pretty healthy product. People like that. And I guess all of retail is being encouraged to make sure they're selling more healthy food and less of the bad stuff for us. So it's good to have those things.
Yeah, yeah, so interesting. I think it's a much broader topic talking about consumer information on products. I mean, I think it's tough for a consumer as well. It's once you know about these things, or if you can take the time to understand, what goes into the MSC logo and standard, but who has the time to do that? If you're talking a mum or dad going around doing their weekly food shop, zooming around, they've only got an hour before they have to get to somewhere else, whipping things off the shelves. It's quite hard to do that for every single product. So I think there's a lot of trust put into some of these logos and some of these statements as well, which hopefully is backed up by the credentials that they have.
Yeah, absolutely. The customer, you couldn't be more right, really. They're time pressed. They've got budget, and of course their budgets have been blown apart in the last 4 or 5 years with the chronic inflation we've seen, and all those aspects that go into tuna have gone into other food areas. It's, in some cases, even more. So, when you're shipping lower value items, the cost of your shipping increasing can have a bigger effect on. And I think we've all seen those baskets grow. So people are often looking to find a cheap alternative, which isn't always necessarily as sustainable or as well fished or as well managed. And it's a sad thing to say, but a lot of people are less interested in some of those things than you or I might be. They rely very much on the fact that there's a retailer, and pretty much all retailers I've dealt with in my experience, and those are kind of the big guys both here and abroad, will have a policy of sustainability and responsibility, and they'll be trying to fit what they do into their global policy, and then sell that to the customer in a wider sense that the customer doesn't need to worry too much. So if you can't, we've got responsibility covered, and we see it. We see it in retailers all the time, advertised in store, in any in-house magazines, on carrier bags, on TV adverts, on the internet now, of course. Everyone's got a position, and they do rely on some of the logos, and some of those logos are good, some of those fisheries are less good. So yeah, we rely on a lot of things when we go shopping for tuna and other products, of course.
Of course. Well, let's hope this podcast in a little way. I mean, this is the ethos. It's of course it's quite a niche topic. It's going to be for people that are looking to find out a little bit more behind the everyday foods and products that they have. So, but it's it's still a commitment from anyone to listen through to this series and find out more about their products. And we're only going to be touching on very few that you'd find on supermarket shelves and other places. So yeah, very, very challenging. But I think these type of schemes can do a lot of good to standardize commitments from lots of people across the industry, some auditing of different things. So I think some trust can be put in it as long as they're held to account and also checked for how robust they are regularly also.
100%. In my last 30 plus years in retail, I've seen that understanding of supply chains go from, in some cases a very good level, in some cases less good. Everyone's moved along that continuum in the last 30 years. And I can sit here and be critical about what some people do, but I can see they've moved. But that's fine. Adding some criticism helps people improve their game still. And I guess we've also got the wonderful internet that we're talking over right now that's up all these things for people. So we can start and see what other people are experiencing, which can be good and bad. Obviously, we can, a message can be around the world twice in the blink of an eye these days. But it does mean there's less place to hide. It does mean that, sometimes for us, uncovering things that are happening that shouldn't be happening is easier in all of our supply chains. We can see what's going on. We've got the ability to, we're looking at having some better contact with the vessels that fish, so we can see what's going on, see that the practices are good. There's definitely room for improvement on those. We've pressed governments to make sure that there's good legislation in place, that the boats are doing as they're told, and the skippers understand what they should be doing. And we press some of the regulatory bodies to make sure that their standards are constantly improved. And from my perspective and the supply chains I've been involved in, we've been pushing very heavily for action on these big aggregating devices that cause so much damage, and on human rights for people fishing. I find it bizarre that we can have sustainable tuna that's fished by people whose livelihoods aren't sustainable.
Yeah.
We rely a lot on what's going on in the market, and we hope that customers will keep demanding improvements.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's a great place to move on to and just think about, what the future looks like, from your perspective. It'd be great to hear, I'm going to assume demand will continue to grow as the global population grows for tuna and seafood. But from your perspective, are things improving, and what are the big challenges that you see that the industry has to start to tackle in the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a big question, Ben, and I think I've covered some of those things. I'll repeat myself. I don't mind repeating myself. I suppose we've got this massive global catch of, as I said, 6.5 to 7 million tons of fish a year. There probably isn't much space for that to grow. So skipjacks are pretty prolific fish. We're probably fishing close to the limits of that which we can realistically fish to. Obviously, there'll be some movement amongst territories and people who go in and out, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to make sure that globally and across the nations and within those nations, we're managing that reliably and honestly, because we've seen too many fisheries fail over the years, and often they're failing for political reasons. There's North Atlantic fisheries at the minute in Europe that are struggling. I think as we speak here in the second week of November, there are negotiations for quotas for some of our more local fish stocks happening, and some of those fish stocks are in a pretty bad way, where you've got different nations haggling over how much they can catch. So we need to make sure we continue to have good and strong management, and that relies on strong governments dealing with the facts, not what possibly the fishers want or some of the big entities want, because there's often influence, as there is in all these things. So really well-managed fisheries, number one. Number two, we need to really continue to press on the rights of people that are in the fishing trade. It employs a phenomenal number of people around the world procuring fish, and tuna being one of the biggest is no different to that. But making sure that people that are in that supply chain, whether they be the people on the fishing boat, people, the cooks on the fishing boat, the fishermen, the engineers, all the way through the supply chain to the people working in factories, are properly remunerated. They're not there under duress. They've got all of their basic rights addressed and looked after. And we are making moves on that, but there's a lot more work to do on that. And then in terms of just the environmental impact of fishing, obviously carbon output's becoming a big point of action for all of us, I guess. And we need to see work going on in terms of engine design, boat design, fishing efficiency to make it less impactful that way. But also looking at the gear we use. So these aggregating devices that are left in the ocean, net design that we don't allow nets to drift off and carry on fishing, or long lines to do the same thing. So there's a lot of self-regulation, but there's also, I'm pretty sure, some technical advances can come in gear type and approach to that. And then, there's a big drive in the industry towards monitoring. So having independent monitors on board vessels. Now, sometimes that's quite difficult for people, but there's AI solutions that are now beginning to come to the industry. Some are really clever. I've seen some that can, in a mixed fishery like we'd have around the UK coast, where you put your net in and you bring out a number of different fish. Some of this AI stuff can look at the fish and actually identify what's coming out of the net, so they can detect if it's a plaice or a cod or a skate or a whatever. That's super expensive at the minute, but as we move forward and this stuff gets cheaper and more accessible, getting better coverage on the boat. So, the disinfectant of being able to see what's happening is really important in any supply chain. And some of your other episodes have dug into that a little bit. But once you can know what's there, it's much easier to manage. If you've got some good management and strong management, and we can get better agreement between those nations, which is historically probably harder in here we are in the 2020s than it's been for the last 70 years post the war. I mean, we're in a geopolitically difficult position right now.
Mm-hmm.
Take the big players out, everyone's just trying to do what's best for them, and we need to make sure we're doing what's best for the fishery and the planet. Yeah, and the fads stop the destructive side of fishing and keep on with the good stuff.
Yeah. Well, I hope that does continue, because it's great for you to call out those key areas, and it sounds as though some progress is being made. But yeah, also really interesting for you to make us realise that we're probably at the maximum in terms of volume that we are fishing at the moment. Therefore, if demand does grow, it's how would that be serviced, and that needs to be managed in a way that doesn't cause further or irreparable damage to our oceans and to those fish stocks. Yeah, there's it sounds though there's hope there for sure, but there's still a lot to do, and very similar to other supply chains. Iain, fantastic conversation. Before we finish, anything that we haven't covered in this conversation that you would think to yourself in an hour's time after we finish this, you think that would have been great to mention? Wanted to ask you that.
Okay, that's a slightly left field question, isn't it? We've had a good row around the fisheries, and you can tell from my answers the last hour, my focus remains and has always been on the more sustainable, lower impact fisheries. So, it would be a shout out for those. Anyone listening that's contemplating buying their tuna, look at the impact that the fishery is having on the planet and the supply chain within it, and lower impact is typically better. And any support anyone can give to keeping pressure on those players that maybe don't do such a good job, we should carry on doing that. Look, it's a fascinating world. We've covered a lot. We've covered a lot of ground in the last hour, and hopefully we've got enough material for the podcast. So I may have that thought in an hour, but right now I'm not worried that I'm going to be wandering off and thinking, I should have mentioned that. Maybe that will come.
No, I think we've really gone through it, and like we always say with all of these, I mean, we could speak for another 2-3 hours. I mean, they're so huge. There's so many different avenues that you could go in. But I think for anyone listening, hopefully that's given, that's really got under the hood of the tuna supply chain and the different types, how it's fished. And it's been fascinating for me to understand as well. So I thank you deeply for that. It's been a really, really great conversation. Any final thoughts from your side? I usually ask advice for what consumers need to do, but you've already touched on some elements there, which I think was really fantastic, for people to be more conscious and look for some of those different attributes that it has. But anything else to leave people with, after they've listened to this podcast? They've obviously been curious, but what else can they do to be more conscious consumers of this particular product?
Ask where your fish has come from. Look at your retailer's policy. I would say always try and buy 1-by-1 caught tuna every time, rather than anything more industrial. And enjoy your fish. It's a great product. Enjoy it.
Fantastic. I'm sure people will. Well, Iain, thank you so much. Just to close off, how do people, if they wanted to get in touch with you or some of the work that I know that you're doing, what can you leave us with in terms of the things that you're working on, and if anyone wanted to get in touch for anything deeper?
I guess probably through the podcast they can get in touch. We'll be on LinkedIn, I'm guessing, so that would be fine. Currently, I'm working on a couple of things. I'm working with a couple of charitable foundations, one supporting 1-by-1 fisheries and one supporting more wider fisheries, but looking at smaller scale guys who are doing the right thing with a much more social element involved in them. So last week I was away looking at exploring some small scale langoustine fisheries in Scotland. We're talking to some number of different people around the world, so it's not a UK based scheme. Some are really artisan, some are slightly bigger, but those are things I'm doing. We're trying to get further aid and further help people get sustainably caught fish to market.
Fantastic. Well, maybe if you're willing, then, and people wanted to understand a bit more, we could put some links to some information maybe in the show notes or something like that. But I think it sounds fantastic that after this career starting as a chef and then moving through to all of your experience in this industry. I think it's great that from all of your experience, you've seen some of the challenges there, and you're really trying to work on things to tackle it and make things better. So really fantastic place to finish.
Great
Iain, thank
stuff.
you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for your time. I'm sure everyone's enjoyed it as well. And I wish you all the best for the future and hope to talk again soon.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.